Hello, my name is Darryl Davis. I'm Head of Anti-Fraud Services at MIAA. I'd like to start today by saying a big thank you for taking the time to watch this anti-fraud awareness video. The purpose of the video is to give you some information about how fraud impacts on the NHS, give you some examples of cases where fraud has been proven against people who seek to defraud the NHS, and to give you some information on who to contact and raise concerns should you ever have any need to do so. So in terms of fraud, people often say, is fraud an issue in the NHS? And very often when people defraud the NHS, they kind of use the mentality of, well, the NHS is a multi-billion pound organisation, and therefore if I defraud it by £10, £100, £100,000, £1 million, what does it really matter? There are no victims of NHS fraud. Well, there are victims of NHS fraud, and essentially all of us watching this video are victims of NHS fraud due to the fact that we either use NHS services or we contribute to the funding of the NHS through paying our taxes. And essentially any time anybody defrauds the NHS, they're taking away money from where it should be rightly going, and that is to the funding of patient care. So wherever possible in the work that I do as a fraud specialist, I seek to try and recover any amounts that have been lost to the NHS where fraud can be proven. So what is the impact of fraud on the NHS? Well, the latest estimate is an estimate of around about £1.27 billion. What does that equate to in real terms? Well, that could be 22,000 GPs, it could be 40,000 staff nurses, 116,000 hip replacements, or 5,000 ambulances. So as you can see, there's serious impact from those who defraud the NHS. Within the NHS, the first national counter-fraud strategy was set up in 1998, and since then there have been various initiatives to try and reduce fraud and bring it to a minimum. Each NHS organisation has to have an appointed, nominated local counter-fraud specialist, and MIAA provide that service to your organisation. The local counter-fraud specialist has a defined role in terms of complying with national strategy, and there are 4 key elements to the work that we do within your organisation. The first one being around inform and involve, so that's making sure that staff are aware of fraud issues, are briefed on the latest trends and developments that are emerging, so you can help both prevent fraud from occurring yourselves and also prevent losses to the organisation. We also look through prevent and deterring to strengthen systems and controls that are in place within the organisation, whether it be strengthening policies, procedures, or providing professional advice to ensure that the opportunities to commit fraud are reduced. Where we receive allegations of fraud, then we investigate. All local counter-fraud specialists are trained to conduct criminal investigations, and they will conduct those investigations in accordance with recognised legislation, with the ultimate aim of securing sanctions. That is, ensuring an outcome from the investigation work that we do wherever possible, be it through cases going to criminal court, be it through disciplinary sanction, or be it through referral to a professional body like the NMC or the GMC. And lastly, as counter-fraud specialists, we're accountable to the organisation for the work that we do. We have to agree a plan of work each year with the Director of Finance, the Chief Financial Officer, and report through periodically to the Audit Committee to show progress against the work that we're undertaking. So as you can see, it's quite a varied and wide-ranging role that we perform within your organisation. People often say, what is fraud? And very often people get confused between fraud and theft. And that's because in legal terms they're both very similar. When you steal something, when you commit a theft, you're taking away somebody else's property without the intention of returning it. With fraud, that situation is mirrored except for one distinct difference. That is deception. If you try and deceive somebody to obtain their property, obtain money, funds, whatever it may be, that is when it becomes fraud. So for example, if you drive your car into a petrol station, you fill up with petrol and just drive off without paying, that's straightforward theft. You've taken the petrol without any intention for paying for it. If on the other hand you drive your car up to the petrol pumps, you fill it with petrol, you go into the kiosk and hand over a forged credit card to the cashier, then you're committing fraud because you're trying to deceive that individual that what you're handing over is a genuine means for paying for the petrol when you know that it isn't. So that's the distinction. If you try and deceive somebody, it becomes fraud. Most of the work we do falls under the Fraud Act of 2006, and there are 3 key offences. The first one being false representation. So an example of that would be saying in your daily life, if you go online and buy yourself some designer clothes or designer aftershave or perfume, and actually the person selling it to you knows that those items are fake, then that would be false representation. You think you're buying something genuine when in fact you're not. Within the NHS, if you put false information on a travel expenses form or on a timesheet for hours that you haven't worked or for mileage that you haven't undertaken, that becomes fraud because you're trying to deceive the person authorising that document that what's on there is genuine. The second one is failing to disclose information. So another example of that would be if you apply for health insurance and you fail to disclose a pre-existing medical condition. That would be considered potentially an act of fraud. In terms of the NHS, this could take place of failing to provide information, say in relation to previous criminal convictions when an individual is applying for a post within the NHS. That again is another example of where fraud could occur. The last one is abuse of position. Predominantly, this occurs when individuals act against the best interests of the organisation that they work for. So an example would be somebody awarding a procurement contract to a particular supplier when they weren't the cheapest supplier to go with. That would be an example of abuse of position. In all these cases, the ultimate sanction could be 10 years in prison and an unlimited fine. So as well as criminal sanctions, there are also other penalties that could be applied if you're found to have committed fraud against the NHS. This could include losing your job as a result of a disciplinary investigation, potentially losing your future pension entitlements if you're unable to pay back the money that's been defrauded to the NHS. And there are also implications if you're registered with a professional body for a referral to be made to them, which could result in you being struck off. So there are real serious implications, not only from a criminal perspective, if you should defraud against the NHS. Another relatively new piece of legislation is the Bribery Act 2010. Now essentially this makes it an offence to give or receive a bribe. What does that mean? Well, a lot of people see probably envelopes of stuff full of cash being handed over between two individuals as being typical bribery, but it's essentially anything that induces somebody to commit an act that goes against the best interests of the organisation that they work for. And like with the Fraud Act, there is also a 10-year potential prison sentence and unlimited fine that can be applied. And also importantly for NHS organisations, if they're found not to have adequate procedures and processes in place to try and prevent bribery, they too could also face an unlimited fine. So what kind of groups of individuals can potentially defraud the NHS? Well, ultimately, anybody who comes into contact with the NHS could seek to defraud it. And indeed, there have been examples around a wide variety of categories of individuals and groups that have defrauded the NHS over the years. Some examples of these include patients. You may not necessarily think that patients would defraud the NHS, but there have been examples where patients have claimed for exemptions on receiving prescriptions when they're not entitled to them. There have been examples of relatives of patients claiming transport expenses to and from hospital, again where they weren't entitled to do so. Obviously, management and staff of the NHS can defraud it, and again there have been examples of individuals who defrauded through a variety of means, whether it be for submitting false timesheets, false travel expenses, false invoices, or indeed putting false information on application forms to apply for posts within the NHS. There's also a range of contractors and suppliers who have sought to defraud the NHS over the years, either by providing false information on invoices, by adjusting bank account details to divert payments into false bank accounts. So a variety of ways in which the NHS can be defrauded. And unfortunately, like every public and private sector organisation, where you have the mixture of money, finances, systems and people, there is always the potential for fraud to occur. So as well as those groups that I just mentioned, there are also organised criminal gangs that target the NHS, and they do this in a variety of ways, often using either cyber techniques to access NHS systems or to send scam emails to a variety of recipients, hoping that somebody will respond and either click on a link and provide information to them that they can use for the purposes of fraud, or to actually install malicious malware onto a laptop or PC that they can then use to take control. So examples of that would be in the summer of 2019, where there was a targeted email attack across NHS organisations where individuals were asked to click onto a hyperlink to access ESR. So what they would do, they would click on the hyperlink, access ESR, but when they thought they were getting onto the real ESR site, actually they were getting onto a fake site which was harvesting their login details and also their passwords. What the fraudsters then did was actually go into the genuine ESR system using that data and then change the bank account details of employees so that when payments were made through the normal salary run, they were actually diverted to false bank accounts. We also remember as well the WannaCry situation, the cyber attack a couple of years ago. Again, another example of where fraudsters have targeted the NHS to hold it to ransom in order to pay money to release access to key fundamental systems within NHS organisations. Very much we need to be aware of local fraud threats that can be undertaken by staff and people who use NHS services locally, but also we need to be aware of the wider environment of organised crime who will be targeting the NHS on probably a daily basis. I'm now going to cover some real life fraud cases. A consultant radiologist. It was agreed this person could work overtime in excess of their contracted hours. They did this to the tune of £24,000, but in fact they were doing this overtime work in their normal NHS hours, which also meant that some of their routine tasks weren't undertaken. The individual pleaded guilty at Crown Court and was sentenced to 15 months in prison, suspended. They also had to serve 200 hours of community service, repay £14,000 of costs, as well as the £24,000 in overtime that they'd fraudulently claimed. They were also referred to their professional body, which in this case was the General Medical Council. A healthcare assistant working in a local Northwest trust. This individual provided information on the death of 3 of his relatives in order to gain paid sick leave from his post, when in fact none of these 3 family members had died. This individual pleaded guilty at Crown Court, was sentenced to 12 weeks in prison, suspended, was also made to pay £5,000 in compensation back to the NHS, and was dismissed from their position. Another case involves a member of staff and her husband who were both convicted for defrauding the NHS. Essentially, the case here involved ordering printer cartridges that were not needed by the NHS in the particular office where this person worked. They took those printer cartridges away from the NHS and sold them on eBay, with the individual's husband then delivering those printer cartridges to various locations across the country. They both went to court. The person who worked for the NHS was sentenced to 26 months in prison, with their husband being sentenced for another 13 months for essentially handling stolen goods. An NHS surgeon who was found to be lying on his application form claimed that he performed 85 specific procedures when in fact he'd only completed 6. As a result, he was involved in 4 patient deaths, and it resulted in a £2 million negligence bill for the trust. Ultimately, he was sent to jail for 6 years, and in the time that he was employed with the NHS, he was paid over £300,000 in salary. A nurse who was found guilty of working while sick, essentially working for other employers whilst off sick from their NHS post, which resulted in receiving double pay, their sick pay and their pay from the secondary employer, to the value of £32,000. This individual was sentenced to 16 months in prison, was dismissed from their post within the trust, and were also struck off by their professional body. This next case involves an NHS IT director and the awarding of a £950,000 contract. As part of the arrangements to get this contract in place, the NHS director was paid £80,000 in corrupt payments. The deal was struck in an Indian restaurant where the director asked the supplier, "What's in it for me?" Ultimately, what was in it for him was 3.5 years in prison, along with 14 months served by the supplier. This next fraud involves a chief executive officer at an NHS trust. She signed off an £11,000 invoice which had actually been submitted by her husband for work that hadn't been undertaken at the trust. On top of this, she failed to actually declare an interest in that her husband did have a genuine business. When the investigation took place, they tried to cover their tracks by providing information to indicate that this work had been undertaken, but unfortunately they used information in a published report that had been issued after the date of the invoice that was submitted to the trust. Ultimately, the chief executive officer was sentenced to 16 months in prison, suspended, and ordered to undertake 250 hours of community service. Her husband was sentenced to 2 years, suspended, and also had to undertake 150 hours of community service. Linking to the Bribery Act and some of those cases that we've just gone through, one of the key issues that comes out in certain cases is the failure to declare interests, and also issues around accepting gifts and hospitality, which could be perceived as being a bribe. Within the organisation you work in, there are clear policies and procedures laid out for declaring interests, as well as how you resolve situations where you're offered potential gifts and hospitality in the course of your role with the organisation. Now, very often when thinking about should I declare or not, it's very useful to use the newspaper test. So essentially, what kind of headlines could be made if the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Mirror, whoever got hold of this information? What kind of sensational headlines could they create? The best advice we can give is always to declare. Not only are you protecting the organisation that you work for, but you're also protecting yourself as well. So the best piece of advice I can give you following today's video is to look at both your gifts and hospitality policy, your declarations of interest policy, and also your fraud policy, because they will give you some helpful hints about how you should be conducting yourself in the course of your NHS work. So hopefully in the course of your employment with the NHS you won't come across any NHS fraud, but it's very important to know what to do should you ever have any concerns. So importantly, you need to make note of any relevant information that you think may be helpful in explaining your concerns. Gathering any particular information around contact details, documentation that you think may be potentially fraudulent, is keeping those safe and secure and reporting them through to the appropriate channels, which I'll cover later. More importantly, it's important not to ignore the problem, because potentially if you ignore it, the problem can increase and therefore the value of loss to the NHS can be greater. In the course of conducting our investigations, what we often see is that a fraud relatively will start off at a small scale, but as people get more confident and think they can get away with it, then the values can increase significantly. It's very important as well that you don't investigate it yourself. As I touched on at the start of this video, all counter-fraud specialists are specifically trained in conducting criminal investigations, and potentially if you start gathering evidence, speaking to people, it could jeopardise a criminal case. So it's very important that you follow the recommended reporting routes to raise your concerns. So lastly, who should you report fraud to? On the screen now are a list of options for you to think about if you ever have any concerns. We would encourage you to either contact your Director of Finance or Chief Financial Officer. Contact directly your local counter-fraud specialists, whose details are normally either in the counter-fraud policy or on your organisation's intranet page. If you don't want to speak to anybody in person, you can report anonymously to the Counter-Fraud Authority through Crime Stoppers. You can either telephone on 0800 028 4060, that's 0800 028 4060, or go online at www.cfa.nhs.uk and you can access through that website an online reporting tool. It's very important that you report any concerns that you may have and use one of these options. I'd just like to say thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this video today. I hope you found it informative and useful, and as I mentioned earlier, this is part of an ongoing awareness program that we have within your organisation, so in future you will see a number of different publications, articles, etc. from your local counter-fraud specialist. I would say at this point, although we have covered how fraud can impact on the NHS, it's only a very, very small minority of individuals who do seek to defraud the NHS. And as noted, where those individuals are identified and a case can be brought against them, we always seek to try and recover the monies that's lost back to the NHS. Thank you very much for your time.